Hey everyone, as you all know, one of my favorite things to debunk is creationism in all its varieties, and there's a particular scholar that creationists have been referencing lately named Denis Noble. What's he all about, and why do creationists love him so much when he isn't one himself? Let's find out. Denis Noble is a British physiologist who has been somewhat influential, having developed the first mathematical model of cardiac cells in 1960. He was also a co-founder of the field of systems biology, which uses computational modeling to understand how cells and organ systems function. So he is not in the same category as the charlatans at Discovery Institute or other such propaganda outlets. However, in his twilight years, he has stepped outside of his expertise to push unscientific rhetoric in the area of evolutionary biology. To put this into perspective, there's an interesting phenomenon informally known as Nobel disease, or Nobelitis. This is the bizarre tendency of certain Nobel laureates to adopt crackpot ideas later in life. This seems to occur because these scholars, having experienced so much success in their own field, believe they possess the knowledge and expertise to comment on any field of science. And of course, they can hide behind their Nobel Prize, gesturing towards it whenever someone doubts their brilliance. The premier example of this is Luc Montagnier, who won a Nobel for isolating the HIV virus, but then descended into total crackpottery, pushing water memory and other blatantly pseudoscientific nonsense. Now, Denis Noble has never won a Nobel Prize himself, but he does suffer from a similar disease, which, given his surname, could be called Nobelitis as well. Despite being a respected Oxford physiologist, once he retired in the early 2000s, the temptation to dip his fingers into another field was just too great. Now, after a series of books, articles, and more podcast appearances than anyone cares to count, he has come to a startling conclusion. In 2013, he wrote, "All the central assumptions of the modern synthesis, often also called Neo-Darwinism, have been disproved." So what's the modern synthesis, you ask? Noble defines it as a mid-20th century gene-centric view of evolution based on random mutations accumulating to produce gradual change through natural selection. Now, we have to assume that Noble is somehow equating this mid-20th century view with evolutionary theory as understood today in 2025. Otherwise, why would he be referencing the status of science from 70 years ago as if it were currently relevant? Evolutionary biology, according to this physiologist, is stuck in the 1950s, and apparently nothing whatsoever has happened since. Why? Because evolutionary biologists dogmatically cling to their gene-centric neo-Darwinian view of the world, and that has apparently been disproved. Noble, like any good crackpot, has his own theory, which he calls the third way of evolution. Why the third way? Because according to their website, it sits between neo-Darwinism and creationism. It's already bad enough that he references creationism along real science as though they are competing paradigms, but even worse, as we'll soon see, his rhetoric resembles the latter more than the former, claiming that organisms consciously steer their own evolution, a disavowal of the materialism that creationists despise so much. So how did Noble go about developing this revolutionary model? Well, he needed some friends to help. Since it's a model regarding evolutionary biology, you'd bet a lot of money that these people would be predominantly evolutionary biologists, right? Well, you'd lose that money real fast. If you go to the people section of his website, you'll find a bunch of engineers, psychologists, a few cell and molecular biologists, and a whole lot of philosophers. With this crack squad of rogue trailblazers, the third way was launched in 2014, and for anyone who is bad with numbers, that was more than 10 years ago. So the obvious question arises, have evolutionary biologists now recognized the error of their ways and abandoned the neo-Darwinian paradigm in favor of physiologist Noble's take on their field? Well, evolutionary biologist Eric Svensson said it best in a review of the history of evolutionary biology when he wrote, "The enthusiasm for their project has, mildly put, not been overwhelming among evolutionary biologists." He then added, "The sheer confidence by which some philosophers and critics of contemporary evolutionary biology predict that it will soon be replaced by an entirely new framework, details of which are very unclear, is remarkable, particularly as the majority of evolutionary biologists are not even aware of the existence of TWE and carry on their research as usual. In short, nobody cares." Those who doubt this should join any of the regular evolutionary biology congresses organized by the societies ESEB, European Society for Evolution, and SSE, Society for the Study of Evolution, where little of this forthcoming paradigm shift announced by Noble has been visible during the past decade. Not surprisingly, most evolutionary biologists don't even know who Noble is. His supporters often claim he's some giant in the field of evolution, overturning paradigms, and yet no one in the field even knows he exists. A major reason for this is that Noble doesn't publish in journals that specialize in evolutionary biology. He publishes his ideas on evolution in the Journal of Physiology, or the Journal of Experimental Biology, or often the journal that he was the editor-in-chief of for many years, Progress in Biophysics and Molecular Biology. Under Noble's editorship, this journal rapidly became a crackpot journal, publishing papers like Cause of Cambrian Explosion, Terrestrial or Cosmic, in which the authors claimed that octopuses came from outer space. It has also published a series of papers by a pair of creationists, Olin Brown and Dave Hollander, with titles like Neo-Darwinism Must Mutate to Survive, and Darwinian Evolution Has Become Dogma. AI Can Rescue What Is Salvageable. As Svensson also pointed out, Noble never appears at conferences organized by evolutionary biologists, because he knows he'd get completely roasted. Instead, he and his buddies organized their own conferences, like the infamous one held at the Royal Society in 2016 that got a lot of media attention, but which had zero impact on practicing evolutionary biologists. In fact, at that very meeting, Noble got personally called out for his bullshit when he gave a talk on some research that another lab had conducted in which they removed some genes from a species of bacteria that disrupted the development of its flagella. After a few generations, the flagella started working again, and Noble claimed that this was because the organism purposefully responded to the environment by altering its own genome. An audience member, an evolutionary biologist named David Schuker, pulled up the original study on an iPad and shot up his hand. He explained that the study had actually shown that many different regulatory mutations could lead to the reacquisition of the flagellum. The authors concluded, "Our results demonstrate that natural selection can rapidly rewire regulatory networks." Schuker then concluded, "So it's a perfect, beautiful example of rapid neo-Darwinian evolution." Ouch, Noble can't even escape embarrassment at his own conferences. So as you can see, very few evolutionary biologists take Noble seriously, despite the fact that he's had over 10 years to make his case. Of course, crackpots never simply admit defeat. There must be a reason that no one accepts their brilliance. Like any true conspiracy theorist, Noble claims we just need to follow the money. The neo-Darwinian paradigm dominates academia, so it soaks up all the money, and no one is willing to challenge the status quo, no matter how wrong it is, and no matter what is to be gained by forging a new path. It's infantile.
I interact now with a whole group of around a dozen younger academics working in trying to get the funding for the experiments they want to perform. And almost universally, they say that most of their grants are rejected. And the reason is very simple. It is that the rejection will be on the basis that it just simply disagrees with standard theory. Well, we have to break out of that mindset.
This is what electric universe grifters say about gravity. This is what Eric Weinstein says about the entirety of theoretical physics. This is what unqualified cranks peddling supplements on the internet say about nutrition and molecular biology. This is what all charlatans say who want to elevate their bullshit to the status of well-established and universally accepted scientific principles. The problem isn't that they're objectively wrong, it's that the man is keeping them down. Ironically, there is some truth to Noble's sentiment about following the money, and when we follow his money, we find that it comes from the Templeton Foundation, which has aggressively funded pseudoscientific nonsense for decades, leading most serious scholars to boycott them. The foundation displays an obsession with some alleged intersection of theology and science, topics like free will. It's just blatantly obvious that the foundation's purpose is to paint religious dogma as having some kind of scientific basis for the purpose of artificially intellectualizing regressive theocratic politics, which they have also done by repeatedly funding far-right evangelical politicians like Rick Santorum.
Well, I think you have to ask the question, where is the money?
Anyway, it goes without saying that the rest of this video will be devoted to rigorously dismantling Noble's scientific claims. But for those who are not well versed in biology, we should point out that this background information is enough to discredit him by itself. In short, he's become a pseudo-intellectual crank funded by the Templeton Foundation, writing well outside his expertise, who oversaw the publication of papers that claimed octopuses come from outer space, has never once published in an evolution-specific journal, and has been caught in real time either deliberately misrepresenting or egregiously botching a biology paper. Now we're going to dissect all the major bullshit claims of the third way. But before we begin, a quick message. We all want a reliable method of finding accurate information on the internet, especially when it comes to science. Google searches turn up a combination of fact and SEO-driven fiction, leaving us with more questions than answers. Direct scientific literature searches with Google Scholar or PubMed connect you to research papers, but they can be very hard to read, with many behind a paywall. Thus enters Consensus. Consensus is a new wave academic search engine that leverages AI and vector search to find and synthesize the best science for you. Consensus searches across 200 million scientific papers from the highest quality journals and presents referenced information to you in easily digestible fashion. Just ask it any question, like, when did Homo sapiens evolve? We quickly get a concise answer referencing the most up-to-date information pertaining to the relevant fossil evidence. But that's not the end of the investigation. Consensus pulls up the literature that is most relevant to the question, extracts key insights from each paper, and gives you a study snapshot, which summarizes experimental data, methodology, and relevant outcomes. You can do this with any question you have. You don't even need to know the precise keywords because of how vector searches work. Give it specific prompts combined with your search. Ask for the mechanisms of action, or how two concepts correlate with each other, or to explain a topic in simple language. Whatever you need in truly any area of academic study, from economics to anthropology. Is the gut microbiome linked to depression? What's the best treatment for acne? How does a cricket chirp? Whether you're a PhD candidate in evolutionary biology or just a curious Jack or Jill trying to make sense of today's news, Consensus is for you. Join over 2 million people who have already switched to smarter, faster, and more reliable information sourcing. Try Consensus for free. No credit card, no forms. Go to consensus.app and jump straight into your first search today. Okay, back to Denis Noble. To begin the debunking, here's a table that compares what Noble thinks Neo-Darwinism claims and what the third way proposes. Noble relies on two tactics. First, erecting a false straw man version of Neo-Darwinism, which includes a mix of misunderstandings and outright lies. Second, proposing an alternative that is infused with a bunch of pseudoscientific mumbo-jumbo, the precise kind of nonsense that has been promoted and funded by the Templeton Foundation for decades, and which will be totally unrecognizable from the type of propaganda that organizations like Discovery Institute promote. The theme can be summarized as, life can't be the result of naturalistic mechanistic processes like standard evolutionary theory contends. It must have intrinsic meaning and purpose, a purpose that is intended to convey the implication of the Christian God, even though that is not outright stated. Let's dissect each of these points line by line. In doing so, we will show that Noble's entire third way program is just a confused, factually vacuous, bumbling attempt at attacking one of the most well-established ideas in the entire history of science. First things first, we're going to contextualize Noble's term Neo-Darwinism. It's not worth going into the convoluted history of where these labels come from, so even though it's not entirely accurate, in this video we're going to use this term to refer to standard evolutionary theory, as in what is presently accepted by most publishing biologists. This is the only way to proceed with this criticism, because if Noble is really just attacking a historical version of evolutionary biology, who cares? We already know that we understand evolution better now than we did 70 years ago. We care about the current science, so we will treat Noble's rhetoric as an attack on current science. If he wants to argue with ghosts, he can knock himself out, but that would be a little pointless for him to enact and for us to examine. So onwards we go. Next, let's discuss his claim that evolutionary biology is gene-centric. Is this really true? The problem we immediately face is that Noble is using this term incorrectly, and so we have to do a little bit of educating before we can even answer this. In evolutionary biology, gene-centric is the perspective that your genes are ultimately what survive across long enough time spans to cause appreciable evolutionary change. Obviously, an organism's body and all its cells don't persist. Thus, evolution can be studied at the level of the genes, gene, as it's ultimately the target of natural selection. This doesn't mean that your body, what Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene refers to as the vehicle, doesn't matter. Think about it like this. Imagine a hypothetical lizard in which a developmental hiccup occurred such that it hatched with a little red stripe on its head. It doesn't have a gene for this stripe, it's just the result of embryonic development. Let's say a lot of the other lizards find it attractive, and so this red-striped lizard has lots of offspring, but none of them are born with this red stripe. While it helped this lizard in one generation, in the next, the benefit is gone. This is why the vehicle can be favored, but if that vehicle is not a reflection of genes, which are the only things that actually persist across generations, evolutionary change doesn't occur. This is what gene-centrism actually is, but it isn't what Noble thinks it is. He thinks gene-centrism just means that the entire vehicle is determined 100% by genes. That's why he claims that a failure of Neo-Darwinism is the fact that many genomic studies of complex human diseases, like schizophrenia and Alzheimer's, have not found a clear genetic basis. If you define gene-centric as having 100% genetic basis, then sure, this would falsify it, but no one actually believes that. There are genes which guide organismal development, but they are not the only factor. We can go all the way back to the 1920s to the work of R.A. Fisher and Sewell Wright, two of the leading figures of the modern synthesis, to show that no neo-Darwinist ever believed in Noble's interpretation of gene-centrism. Fisher invented the word variance in 1918 to explain how traits were determined by genetic, environmental, and developmental variances, and he showed mathematically how we could calculate the contribution of each. Today, we call this idea heritability. It's as if Noble knows absolutely nothing about what evolutionary biologists actually do. He likes to claim that evolutionary biology is gene-centric because it makes it sound reductionistic, which has become a naughty word among philosophers and, of course, the funding board of the Templeton Foundation. So we have just conclusively demonstrated that Neo-Darwinism was never a gene-centric theory in the manner that Noble implies. But does it propose that the environment can't influence the genes? Noble claims that the Neo-Darwinian paradigm contends that genes are protected from the environment by the Weissmann barrier. He will say that new research in transgenerational epigenetic inheritance has overturned this, but the neo-Darwinists just won't give it up. Let's dissect this ridiculous claim as well. First, the Weissmann barrier is the simple idea that what happens to your body doesn't typically influence your germline cells, or gametes. If you lose a finger in an accident and then have a child, that child won't be born missing that finger, but if you inherit a mutation from your parents that causes you to not develop a fifth finger, you can pass that on. The logic here is that information flows from the germ cell to the somatic cells, but not the other way around. And it is ultimately genes in the germ cells that are immortal, in Weissmann's words, because they persist across generations, whereas body cells all die. In animals, this is still largely true to this day. Think about the quadrillions of mutations that happen in your somatic cells over the course of your life. All the abrasions, warts, freckles, liver damage, and everything else that you subject your body to. Virtually none of that will be transmitted to your offspring. This is biology 101. In plants and unicellular organisms, the Weissmann barrier doesn't apply, and this was known even in Weissmann's day. This is because a plant's germ cells form from vegetative meristems, so they can be influenced by somatic changes. Obviously, unicellular organisms don't have a separation of somatic and germline cells, since they are just one cell, so this does not apply to them either. How can it be that Neo-Darwinism relies on the absolute nature of the Weissmann barrier, as Noble claims, if a large chunk of biodiversity was known even in Weissmann's time to not possess such a barrier? Is he pretending that biologists don't know what plants and bacteria are?
There is a barrier. It's sometimes called the Weissmann barrier, and it is absolute. Nothing can go across it.
As you can see, he clearly means to convey that biologists believe the barrier to be absolute or impassable. This simply is not true. He's either deliberately lying or he doesn't actually understand this concept. Furthermore, we've learned a lot since 1892 when Weissmann proposed this idea. Again, evolutionary biologists aren't just reading dusty old books and doing no original research. By the 1940s, neo-Darwinists had discovered what are called maternal effects, which is when the mother's egg cell influences the traits of her children independent of their genotype. Later, we learned that the cause of this was epigenetics, which refers to the different factors that influence gene expression without directly altering the DNA sequence. sequence, often relating to histone modification, which are the proteins that DNA coils around and which influence what genes are available for transcription. So at least since the 1940s, when Denis Noble was a child, neo-Darwinists accepted that the Weissmann barrier isn't absolute. But that doesn't mean it's something totally irrelevant. Again, children aren't born missing fingers if their parents lost some. This is trivial. So what does Noble say about this? He claims that since the Weissmann barrier isn't absolute, it allows the flow of information to go from the environment back into the DNA, since genes aren't fully isolated. To Noble, this violates the so-called central dogma of molecular biology. This reveals the stunning fact that Noble doesn't seem to know what the central dogma even is. In 1970, Francis Crick defined it as follows. The central dogma of molecular biology deals with the detailed residue-by-residue transfer of sequential information. It states that such information cannot be transferred back from protein to either protein or nucleic acid. The important phrases here are residue-by-residue and sequential information. By sequential information, he's referring to the precise sequence of DNA letters, A, T, C, and G, as it relates to the precise sequence of amino acid residues in the protein that a gene codes for. For example, the DNA triplet CCT, which is one possible codon, is converted during transcription into RNA as CCU, since RNA uses uracil instead of thymine, and then is read by a ribosome during translation as coding for the amino acid proline. The DNA sequential information was CCT, the RNA was CCU, and that has resulted in the amino acid proline. The central dogma simply states that you can't go from proline back to CCT. Why not? It's very simple. The genetic code is redundant. There are 4 ways to get proline: CCT, CCC, CCA, and CCG. You can't tell by looking at a proline residue which of these 4 codons coded for it. Hence, the precise DNA sequential information has been lost and cannot be recovered from the amino acid alone. Look at this chart of RNA codons. You can see very clearly how multiple sequences result in the same amino acid. This is because there are 20 amino acids found in extant life and 4 DNA bases to code for them. One-to-one correspondence doesn't work. 4 bases can't code for 20 amino acids, so we need codons with more than 1 base in them. If codons were 2 bases, that would be 4 squared, which is 16 possibilities, so that's not quite enough either. That means nature had to use codons with 3 bases, and that gives us 4 cubed, which is 64 possibilities, and that's quite a bit more than 20, which is why there is so much redundancy, with almost all of the amino acids resulting from more than 1 codon, with some corresponding to as many as 6 codons. To be totally clear, this is 9th grade biology knowledge. Transcription and translation, the process by which information flows from DNA to RNA to protein and never from protein back to nucleic acids, is learned by children. And this is all that is meant by the central dogma. It refers to the nature of gene expression. Anyone who brings up things like reverse transcriptase, an enzyme which can convert RNA into DNA, as some kind of violation of the central dogma, are only demonstrating that they don't know what it means. Why Crick even referred to it as a dogma in the first place is a bit mystifying, since he was simply trying to emphasize its central and powerful nature, rather than make any kind of religious or philosophical implication. It probably wasn't the best choice of words, but people like Noble capitalize on it in order to paint evolutionary biology as stubbornly clinging to outdated information, which is actually what religious zealots do, not scientists, as is evidenced by the incredible progress that has been made in evolutionary biology and every other scientific field over the past century or two. Back to the point at hand, notice how this explanation of the central dogma has nothing to do with the basic fact that the environment influences gene expression, or that epigenetic markers can be inherited. Once again, Noble attacks the central dogma because it's called a dogma, and that is in line with his goal to paint Neo-Darwinism as a religion. How do you defeat a religion? You show that their dogmas are wrong, but at the very basic level, we should expect a world-renowned physiologist to at least understand the central dogma.
The central dogma, finished. There is no central dogma.
No, there is, and it's doing just fine, unless you can show everyone how to go from a sequence of amino acid residues back to a specific DNA sequence, which we all know you can't. To get such a basic concept in molecular biology this wrong is embarrassing. And again, this is just one of the many ways that Noble mischaracterizes Neo-Darwinism. All Neo-Darwinists have known the Weissmann barrier wasn't absolute from the beginning. Again, it doesn't even apply to plants or unicellular organisms. And while they didn't know the biochemical basis for it, Neo-Darwinists have been incorporating aspects of epigenetics, like maternal effects, into their mathematical models since the 1940s. Speaking of epigenetics, let's get a closer look at this as well. Since epigenetics exists and is known to occasionally persist to future generations, Noble thinks this undermines Neo-Darwinism, heralding the triumphant return of Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, who posited that physical changes in an organism acquired during its lifetime can be passed on to its offspring. A logical conclusion of his idea would be that a man could work out a lot to become very muscular and then therefore have muscular children, something which is now understood to be totally nonsensical. Noble has written extensively that we should revive this long-maligned French naturalist, that modern molecular biology has vindicated him, and we need to rewrite the textbooks to reflect this.
The Weissmann barrier doesn't stop everything going across it, and so on. You can go through points. So I think we need the textbooks rewriting,
I wonder if Denis has even read the college-level biology textbooks that are used today, because if he did, he wouldn't be making such egregious errors. Let's first make it perfectly clear that Lamarckian evolution is still false for two key reasons. The first is that Lamarck's views on evolution were not synonymous with his views on inheritance. Noble is very confused on this point. Evolution is about how populations change over time, irrespective of the mechanism of inheritance. Both Lamarck and Darwin believed that the environment could shape the hereditary material, so how can Lamarckian evolution be synonymous with the inheritance of acquired characters if Darwin also believed in it? And of course, we now understand that exogenous or endogenous mutagens can alter the genetic material in germline cells, which will then be passed on to any offspring. That is an enormous part of evolution. The environment alters the genome. Everyone knows this. But Lamarck believed that evolution was progressive, and that it was caused by individuals struggling with their environment, exerting their own internal force of will to grow or shrink certain organs in a process he called use and disuse. The famous example is the giraffe stretching its neck to eat more leaves at higher branches. By using its neck muscles, they grew larger, and its offspring would also have larger neck muscles, according to Lamarck. Importantly, Lamarck didn't believe that the individuals would have more offspring and increase their new traits' frequency in the population. He believed that each and every individual giraffe was stretching their necks. Having more offspring is a Darwinian idea resulting from the concept of natural selection, not a Lamarckian one. Lamarckian evolution is not about fitness or even adaptation, but about how organisms get more complex and progress to higher stages of life. All of this is complete bullshit in light of modern biology. No one believes this anymore, and Lamarck's evolutionary ideas should remain in the dustbin of history, no matter how much Noble likes them. But we can see little hints in Lamarck's ideas that make them appealing to people like Noble. Notice how Lamarckian evolution is purposeful. It's progressive, with organisms consciously, through their own efforts, directing the evolutionary process, almost like a divine spark that can't be explained by blind naturalistic processes. Doesn't that sound exactly like the kinds of things Noble says, exactly the kind of nonsense the Templeton Foundation tries to promote? The fact that we still haven't buried Lamarck is not because there's any evidence for his style of evolution, but because some people are philosophically attracted to his ideas. Darwin's view of evolution is cold and indifferent, heritable variation that causes the fitter organisms to have more offspring, and over time, the population becomes more adapted, not because it is trying to be more adapted, but by blind statistics. People don't like that. Some prefer Lamarck's view with its focus on individual agency and meaning, but evolutionary biology is not here to make you feel good or give you meaning and purpose. It's science that explains the emergence and maintenance of biodiversity. And whether you like it or not, the natural processes of evolution don't care about you, just as can be said about the formation of stars, or chemical reactions, or any other subject of scientific inquiry. The second reason Lamarck is wrong is because transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, or the passing of traits from one generation to the next without direct alteration of the primary DNA sequence, has very little evidence for being a major driver of evolution, certainly nowhere near on par with genetic inheritance. The reasons for this have been known for over 100 years, so let's walk through a few examples. For natural selection to be effective on organisms, there must be variation between them, and that variation needs to be heritable. Heritable variation could emerge at the DNA level by mutation, in which case it is classic genetic variation, or it could emerge at the epigenetic level induced by the environment itself. Once again, an example of this would be histone modification, or an alteration of how the genome interacts with the proteins it coils around, thus having an impact on which genes are available for transcription. In agricultural and laboratory settings, humans apply what amounts to environmental pressure on populations to evolve. We select for certain traits by permitting only certain individuals to breed, just like the presence of antibiotics selects for antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Only those which acquire this trait will be able to reproduce. Noble contends that epigenetic inheritance emerges from this environmental pressure, and that's how the environment gets information into the germline. So if that's really how evolution works, then we should be able to remove all the DNA sequence variation from a population, and it should still be able to adapt, because the environment is inducing new variation at the epigenetic level, independent of the DNA. To reiterate, we are talking about epigenetic variation, which does not involve any changes to the actual DNA sequence. So how well can a population adapt if it has no genetic variation? Any freshman biology student can tell you that without genetic variation, populations fail to adapt. This has been confirmed thousands of times by farmers and livestock breeders all around the world, who consistently apply environmental pressure to their stock. But once they've exhausted the genetic variation, that stock ceases to respond to the pressure. In laboratory settings, if you inbreed a population for many generations and then apply a selective pressure to it, that pressure never induces an epigenetic character that allows it to adapt further. Inbred populations are evolutionary dead ends. This is also a principle of conservation genetics. Endangered species that are highly inbred are threatened by the fact that they don't possess the genetic variation to respond to changing environmental conditions. If epigenetics were the prime driver of adaptation, then inbred populations shouldn't be a problem. The environment will just induce new variation, right? The DNA sequence shouldn't need to be different. Epigenetic markers will arise, and this variance can be acted upon by natural selection, thus allowing for evolution in response to stresses. And yet, this does not happen. Ever. There is no room for speculation here. It is utterly conclusive. Furthermore, these facts also imply that epigenetic variation is not wholly independent of underlying DNA sequence variation. Many studies have demonstrated a widespread reliance of epigenetics on DNA sequence variation. Indeed, knockout studies have shown that if you delete the DNA methyltransferase gene, which is involved in methylation, a form of epigenetic silencing, then epigenetic markers disappear entirely from the genome. This demonstrates that epigenetics is not purely an extra DNA phenomenon, but rather is actually controlled by the genome itself, indicating that epigenetic systems evolved by classic Neo-Darwinian means. The emergence of a gene that could influence epigenetic states in response to the environment would be highly favored, and in time the entire system could be elaborated into the complex regulatory networks we see in living organisms today. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, epigenetic inheritance is highly unstable and typically ephemeral. In animals, there's very little evidence that epigenetic markers persist more than 2 to 3 generations after the environmental pressure has been removed. Plants can maintain these markers longer, as would be expected given their general lack of a Weissmann barrier, but long-term evolutionary change requires that variation lasts long enough to spread through the entire population. Otherwise, all that epigenetics is causing is temporary acclimation, not evolutionary adaptation. A related concept, genetic assimilation, is often referenced in order to support the idea that environmentally induced traits can become genetically fixed in a population. Developed in the 1940s, it was proposed that environmental pressures can trigger phenotypic changes, which are then later encoded in the genetic material, making them permanent even if the environmental stimulus later becomes absent. But the reality is that this process is strictly Darwinian. The environment exposes existing genetic variation, and natural selection acts on this variation. The genetic material is not directly modified in response to environmental stimuli, it is simply that chance mutations, which enhance or stabilize the unusual phenotype, get selected for. So any attempt to conflate this phenomenon with Lamarckian inheritance is just plain wrong. To summarize, Lamarckian evolution is wrong because it relies on the false idea of use and disuse, and because epigenetic inheritance has consistently been shown to be profoundly inferior in terms of promoting adaptation when compared with genetic inheritance. While epigenetics is an important source of phenotypic plasticity and perhaps contributes to acclimation over short timescales, there's no evidence that it can drive large-scale evolutionary change. All of this brings us back to the question of why Noble and his acolytes so desperately wish to revive Lamarckian evolution if the evidence for it is so flimsy. The only real conclusion we can draw is that they enjoy the obsolete ideas that Lamarck espoused for political, philosophical, and theological reasons. They want evolution to have a purpose, and they want individuals to have agency in directing their futures. But these desires don't justify lying about an entire scientific paradigm or skewing the results of genetic studies. Science is not about accepting what we want to be true, but discovering what actually is true. Real scientists know this, which means that Noble's rhetoric in this area is guided by a deliberate intent to misrepresent scientific principles to push a theological agenda, even if it's the agenda of his handlers and not his own. Moving right along, nothing gets under the skin of creationists and Templeton-funded buffoons like the concept of random mutations. Noble insists that the idea that mutations happen randomly is another one of those dogmatic assumptions that the early Neo-Darwinists made that has been undermined by modern molecular biology. Noble thinks that mutations happen on purpose. They are directed by the organism that is modifying its own genome in order to overcome challenges that the environment is throwing at it. His crony, the University of Chicago biochemist James Shapiro, has come up with a whole theory around this that he calls natural genetic engineering, something which sounds like it could have come directly from Meyer or Behe at Discovery Institute. Noble believes that random changes to the DNA sequence can't possibly create new things. New forms must have emerged on purpose, by the delicate designing power of the organisms themselves. This is, of course, legitimately insane. First, by random mutations, we should understand it to mean random with respect to an organism's need. That is, you don't get a beneficial mutation just because you need one. The early Neo-Darwinists didn't know whether or not this was true, but several laboratory experiments in the 1940s and 50s demonstrated conclusively that mutations don't occur because you need them to. They are simply always occurring due to replicative error as well as endogenous and exogenous mutagens. It is simply a fundamental characteristic of living organisms that the genetic code does not maintain flawless fidelity, and these changes are random. The first of these experiments demonstrating the random nature of mutation was the Luria-Delbruck fluctuation test of 1943. They subjected several colonies of bacteria to a bacteriophage and then recorded which cell lines obtained resistance. If the environment could induce mutations, then they expected a relatively even number of lines to acquire the mutation across all the colonies, since the selective pressure was the same in each. If mutations were random, however, then there should be a lot of variation between each colony as to whether or not they managed to get the right mutation. Indeed, what they found was very high variation between colonies. How could this possibly be in line with directed mutation? If the environment was inducing the mutations, it was doing a really bad job at it, since the results looked no different from random chance. A similar experiment was conducted by the Lederbergs in 1952, where they showed bacterial resistance to penicillin was not the result of the exposure, but to standing genetic variation. Some of the colonies simply already possessed the variation for resistance to penicillin, and those were the ones that were able to survive. Again, it appeared that the mutation was random with respect to the need of the organism. In modern times, thanks to whole genome sequencing and highly sophisticated statistical techniques, we can reconstruct the full distribution of effects of mutations in organisms. If mutations were directed by the environment or by the organism itself to help it survive a novel pressure, then most mutations that we observe should be helpful. If, however, mutations are random with respect to their impact, then most should be either harmful or neutral, with only a few, by chance, being helpful. The latter case is precisely what we see, and have always seen. Virtually every mutational effect distribution ever measured definitively shows that most mutations are either neutral or harmful. If Noble is correct that organisms are altering their own genomes in a directed way, then they're doing a dog shit job of it. The fact is that natural selection doesn't need organisms to direct their own mutations or for mutations to be biased towards being helpful. Even if only a tiny percentage of all mutations are helpful, population genetic theory, developed by early Neo-Darwinists, demonstrates that selection is still extremely efficient at promoting adaptation. One mutation happens to be beneficial, the fitness of the organism is enhanced, so that mutation will proliferate in a statistically significant way. The simple elegance of this principle is obvious in hindsight, given what we now understand about genetics, which makes it all the more ridiculous when people try to deny its power. Getting back to the topic, all of these points are ancillary to the real purpose of the third way. What they really want is for nature to give them a sense of purpose and meaning, because this would act as a rejection of the cold, impartial materialism that creationists desperately rage against. If we emerged from blind, pitiless natural selection, acting upon strictly random mutations, and we are nothing but our genes, how can there be any inherent meaning in the world? How can we have free will if we're just vehicles for selfish genes? Neo-Darwinism must be false, because they can't fathom a world in which meaning isn't handed down to them from somewhere, preferably the Abrahamic God. This disingenuous framing of biology has unfortunately leaked out into popular media. In July 2024, Forbes ran an article titled "Evolution May Be Purposeful and It's Freaking Scientists Out," which was just an interview with Denis Noble. In it, Noble tells the interviewer that the vertebrate immune system is an example of purposeful evolution. Mutations in B cells generate variants until one is capable of destroying the invading virus. He says the organism modifies the genome of its own cells with the explicit purpose to fight infections. In reality, this phenomenon, called somatic hypermutation, is a purely neo-Darwinian process. It's mutation and natural selection for the purpose of increasing the diversity of antibodies. B cells with mutated antibodies undergo selection, and those that produce higher affinity antibodies are preferentially expanded. It's not distinct from any other example of neo-Darwinian evolution except for the rate at which it occurs. It's a rapid trial and error process on antibody designs, and it is in no way guided. It's completely blind. To Noble, that any cell might be prescribed a purpose, like a blood cell or a skin cell, is somehow a challenge to neo-Darwinism, because apparently evolutionary biology thinks that nothing in your body has any purpose. Noble is pretending that neo-Darwinists are freaking out at the idea of anything having a purpose. We're wading into the swamp of philosophy and semantics now, which was inevitable given that over half of the third way clergy are philosophers instead of biologists. But there's a long tradition in science of moving away from prescribing purpose to objects the more we come to understand them. Evolutionary biologists don't use purposive language for the simple reason that we can explain the emergence of the immune system or any other seemingly purposeful behavior in non-human organisms without appealing to words like purpose and agency. Furthermore, using these kinds of words, even colloquially, can mislead the general public, because people tend to think about these terms in anthropomorphic ways. For example, I know Sally down the street has agency, but biologists are telling me now that bacteria have agency too, so Sally and bacteria have the same kind of agency. This is obviously false, so let's try to be more exact. Biological agency, to Noble and friends, refers to an organism's capacity for goal-directed, self-determining activity, and that this agency emerges independently of development, physiology, or adaptation by natural selection. In the 2023 book Evolution on Purpose, edited by Noble and pals, some examples are given of agential behavior. They include things like responding to external stimuli. So, to be clear, Literally everything an organism does to them would be an example of purposeful behavior. Unicellular organisms responding to stimuli via phototaxis or chemotaxis would be an example of agency. So beyond the concept now becoming meaningless, since it is simply a different way of wording a fundamental property of any living organism, if all organisms possess agency, where does this agency come from? There are two possibilities. First, that it emerges in the same way agency comes about in humans. There's a cognitive psychological phenomenon that includes things like intentionality and symbolic reasoning. But this can't be the explanation for universal agency because it requires complex brains, and organisms like bacteria clearly don't have these. Why do simpler organisms display agential behavior then? A rather obvious reason is that it promotes their survival and reproduction. If a paramecium comes across chemicals in its surroundings that are released by one of its predators, it would improve its probability of survival to be able to move away from that area. If variation existed in this population of paramecia such that the capacity for chemical recognition and subsequent response arose, then those capable of detecting predators would survive more often and leave more offspring until eventually the entire population is capable of this agential behavior. This makes it very clear that what is being described as agency is a product of adaptation by natural selection. Neo-Darwinists thus avoid using words like agency and instead rely on concepts such as fitness, strength of selection, adaptation, and so forth, because these words make it perfectly clear that evolution is the statistical association between survival and reproduction with heritable variation. This kind of language can apply without confusion to all organisms. Sally and the bacteria each have adaptations due to the past action of natural selection, but this does not imply that Sally and a bacterium are the same. To speak of different agencies is useless and confusing. This neo-Darwinian paradigm is not only conceptually useful, but it has resulted in mountains of empirical insights, including explaining how things like cooperation and altruism evolve in organisms that don't even have complex brains. No such advance has ever been made by taking the perspective that organisms have agency. For organismal agency to be a unique research avenue, it needs to make different predictions than those made by neo-Darwinism or adaptation by natural selection. But all the examples proposed of purpose-driven actions in nature are exactly those explainable by natural selection. These are things like choosing a mate, foraging for food, responding to stimuli, and so forth. If these behaviors are hallmarks of agency, then agency can't be some understudied phenomenon in science, because all of these behaviors have been investigated extensively, making it impossible to claim that there is some brand new paradigm that needs to be investigated. The issue is that the agency hypothesis makes the exact same predictions as the neo-Darwinian one. They are what is called coextensive, but unlike the neo-Darwinian paradigm, which provides a process-based natural mechanism for explaining the emergence of what could be referred to as agency, the purposive perspective does not. All it asks of us is to not see organisms like machines, but active agents. This is a philosophical plea, not the ground plan for a new research program. A key reason that agency-based theories of organisms are vacuous is because they are ultimately empirically unfounded. If an organism displays a kind of purposeful behavior, then we can ask two questions. Is it human cognition, in which case we can ask a person why they did something, or is that behavior connected to fitness, in which case we can explain the behavior as a result of adaptation by natural selection. But if an organism does something that isn't clearly related to fitness or human psychology, it's impossible to know if that behavior was undertaken on purpose. You can't ask a paramecium if it really wanted to swim into the open arms of that amoeba. It's critical in science for research programs to have an empirical foundation, and this is totally lacking in the purpose-driven perspective. We can demonstrate this with a great flowchart from a recent paper titled Biological Agency, a Concept Without a Research Program. Without an empirical grounding, Noble veers outside of the realm of science when he talks of agency in organisms that is not explainable by natural selection or basic biochemistry. If neither of these things explain goal-directed behavior, then the behavior is either not shared by all organisms organisms or cannot be determined empirically and is thus outside of the purview of science. So if there's no scientific backing for this idea, why are there so many scientists on the Third Way website? Why is it that so many big brains like Noble can't resist using this kind of purposive language? For those not religiously motivated, the answer is probably psychological. Humans are drawn to explaining all kinds of things with purposive language that clearly don't have purposes. In 1944, psychologists put together a series of still animations showing an open box and what looked like triangles and circles moving around that box. When shown to participants, most of them said that the triangles and circles were trying to get in the box, despite the fact that inanimate objects don't have intentions and can't try to do anything. Another study examined how people responded to the question, "The Earth has an ozone layer in order to protect it from UV light." The question was posed on a timer, so people had to answer quickly to test implicit purposive thinking. Again, the Earth is an inanimate object which can't have a purpose, and the same goes for atmospheric particles. But the majority of participants, when put on a timer, said this statement was true. Then, if given time to think about it, researchers found that participants with religious backgrounds were more likely to still assign the Earth purpose than those with non-religious backgrounds, who, with more time, answered the question in the negative. So humans seem to have an implicit bias towards prescribing purpose to things that don't have any. The interaction between our implicit biases and our tendencies towards supernatural thinking all lead us to seeing flamingos in the clouds, Jesus on a piece of toast, or a man in the moon. Evolutionary biologists recognize these biases and know that while it appears that organisms have purpose, the majority of the behaviors we observe are the result of adaptation, not intrinsic agency and purpose. Noble has either been duped by his own preconceived biases, or he's been paid to misrepresent science, or maybe a little bit of both. At the end of the day, anyone who thinks Noble should be regarded as a credible figure in evolutionary biology needs to ask themselves, why do so few scientists take Noble's ideas seriously, but so many creationists and conspiracy theorists salivate over them? Why, in over 10 years since Noble claimed Neo-Darwinism has died, have evolutionary biologists not taken notice, causing him to go on podcasts to try and make his case? People who are in denial of reality will insist that the entire field is corrupt and dogmatic, refusing to acknowledge this powerful paradigm shift in biology, much like other great scientific minds in history who Noble must undoubtedly be like. But the real reason is much simpler. Noble is a crank promoting pseudoscientific ideas on the internet, hiding behind his credentials and achievements in physiology, and pretending that they make him qualified to overturn a discipline he has zero training in. He's bolstered by support exclusively from the general public, in particular the religious, who love to hear that evolution has given their lives meaning and purpose, which has precisely zero value in the scientific community. To spell it out even more clearly, to push his agenda, Noble has had to misrepresent the entire history of evolutionary biology, lie about the basics of molecular biology, and outright slander neo-Darwinists by claiming they only cling to their paradigm for the money. At the end of the day, Noble is just reading into nature what he wants to see, desperately hoping that evolution can give his life meaning. This is an embarrassing end to a renowned physiologist's career. Like those suffering from Nobel disease, he could have just walked away with a pristine record, but instead he let his head grow too big, and now he's gone out and stepped in shit and made an absolute fool of himself. Luckily for him, evolutionary biologists have barely even noticed. That's why you're getting this news from a science communicator instead. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about genetics and evolutionary biology, I have plenty of tutorials on this topic that will help ensure that you don't fall for this type of rhetoric in the future. Knowledge is power, right? So that's it for Denis Noble. If you're a full-blown creationist, you didn't watch this video and you're not listening to me right now. Hopefully some of you out there are not so far gone, but fell for the third way and its deceptive rhetoric nonetheless. I hope this video has helped you see right through these folks and toss them in the garbage can right next to Discovery Institute and all the other charlatans I expose. Until next time.